Hi everyone. So in the last video, we introduced what economics is, how it is the study of how people make decisions when faced with scarcity, and how we can approach the problem of scarcity. Like how can we try to solve this problem of scarcity, the problem that people want more things than what we can actually have, than what is actually available to us. So what I want to do in this video is to get into how we'll actually be learning about economics in the first place, since now we learned, what economics is and how scarcity is kind of like a key component to it all. Let's actually get into how we will be learning about economics in this class. The first thing to note about this is that economics can be broadly divided into two different categories. So economics can be divided into two categories. So that being over here, I'm going to write microeconomics, which of course this is what this class is, right? This is Introduction to Microeconomics. And over on the right side, I'm going to write macroeconomics. Oh, I just realized I don't have the lines set up. Let's go ahead and add that in. It's not lined up great here, but this will be for my future use. So, microeconomics. Microeconomics deals with economics on the small scale. That's why it has that prefix micro in front of the word economics. Micro, of course, meaning small. So we're learning about economics on the smaller scale. And then on the opposite side, we have macroeconomics, which, as you might expect, the term macro means large scale, right? So we're learning about economics on the bigger scale. So basically, um, the difference between these two is that microeconomics deals with how individual actors make decisions when faced with scarcity. And when I say an individual actor, what I basically mean is like how an individual person would make a decision, as well as say how an individual business might make a decision, right? Whether that decision is related to like what to buy, like if we're just talking about what an individual person uh, decisions might be. It might be like, well, what do I want to spend my money on? How much time do I want to work, like full-time versus part-time? Businesses, they can worry about like what types of things do they want to produce, how many workers they want to hire, etc. Right? Now, on the ops end, macroeconomics, when we're dealing with economics on the larger scale, that is dealing with how all of these smaller scale decisions on the micro side can add up and affect the overall economy. So we're dealing with like the overall nationwide economy, or even the global economy at large. So, to get a better idea of some of the differences between the two, let's actually just jot down some example questions, topics, ideas, which might be studied in microeconomics versus macroeconomics. So, to start off with, let's start with an easy question of how do people, and I'll abbreviate here, decide how to spend their money, right? What types of things do they want to buy? How much money do they want to spend on each thing, right? as we covered from last class, like if we're talking about like basic necessities, things like food and shelter, healthcare, how much money do they like set aside for like the food budget versus like healthcare versus etc., right? Versus having money for like uh, their hobbies, entertainment, as well as transportation, things like that. Oh, before we actually get into the next micro question, let's actually contrast this on the macro side with rather than how do people decide like what types of things that they want to buy here, on the right hand side, let's write down what determines what goods and services a nation specializes in. So, Uh, what I mean by this is that, as you are probably aware, different countries have like different sized industries, for like different like fields, like when it comes to things like healthcare versus like manufacturing versus say like different types of services, different types of countries have like different sized sectors of the economy for each of those things. So, of course, some countries might specialize in one type of thing, say manufacturing, while another country might specialize in, say, a different type of thing, say healthcare, right? Just because they have much bigger sectors, much bigger industries in comparison to um, uh, uh, in comparison to others. So here you can kind of see, hopefully, that these two kind of like correlate with each other as well, right? Because on the left-hand side, we are dealing with how like individual people might decide to spend their money, like what types of items, what types of products might people want to spend their money on. Here we are dealing with, well, what types of products does a nation want to kind of like focus on making, right? What types of goods and services do they want to specialize in? So here it's a similar type of question because we're dealing with what types of products in both of these different questions, right? On the micro and macro side. But it's just a difference of, well, perspective, like, well, we're buying things here on the left, and on the right hand side, we're talking about like what types of things are being produced, but as well as um, the scale of things, right? Left hand side, small scale, we're dealing with like people, individual people. Right hand side, we're now talking about a nationwide type of thing. Okay, um, now on the left side, let's go on to another question here. Another type of question we might consider under microeconomics is what determines the prices of products, right? So, like, how are prices actually determined in in a market? How do businesses know what price to charge for all the things that they might want to sell, right? Now, on the right-hand side, under the macro side, a type of question we might consider is what causes inflation? Now, in case you are not aware, the term inflation here refers to the idea that prices generally tend to rise over time. So inflation is just like how quickly those prices are rising over time. So as an example, if the inflation rate is, say, 5%, then that means each year prices overall tend to be 5% higher compared to what they were in the previous year, right? So hopefully you can see how these two things are kind of related as well, because we're dealing with prices for both these types of questions, what determines the prices of products and what causes inflation. But again, it's a different approach to the question, right? Here on the left-hand side, under micro, we are learning about, or we are asking, what determines the prices of like individual products, right? How do businesses decide, okay, I want to charge this number of dollars for this item, and I want to charge that number of dollars for that item? Versus here on the right-hand side, what causes inflation? What causes prices to rise overall over time across the country, right? And then I'll have one last question for both these categories, micro and macro, just to help kind of like hopefully really solidify the idea here. Um, Under micro, I'll ask, when will a firm, by the way, in case you're not aware, firm is just like another term for business, basically. So when will a firm or a business choose to expand, downsize, or close? And then on the right-hand side, I'll ask you, what causes unemployment to rise or fall, right? So again, hopefully you can see how these two things are kind of like related, right? Because the idea here is, of course, if a firm expands, that increases the number of job opportunities, and so with more job opportunities, more people get hired. The unemployment rate across the country should hopefully then go down. But on the flip side, of course, if a firm downsizes or closes, then just the opposite happens, right? Fewer job opportunities, fewer jobs means unemployment rates should then rise afterward, right? So, yeah, hopefully you can kind of see how these two things, micro versus macroeconomics, they deal with like the same ideas, right? The same core ideas here. For these first pair of questions, it's about how do people, well, I shouldn't say people, but how do we know what types of things we want to spend our money on, what types of things we want to produce as well at our jobs? Um, Second pair of questions deals with prices. The third pair of questions deals with jobs, right? The difference here really is just the scale of what we're looking at. Smaller scale for micro, larger scale for macro, right? Um, Now, of course, this is Introduction to Microeconomics, economics, right? So that is going to be our focus. We're going to be dealing with these types of questions. We'll deal with more than just these questions. Of course, we're going to be looking at a lot more than just these things. But these are the types of questions here on the left-hand side that we'll be focusing on. We won't be spending a whole lot of time on the macro side of things. I might occasionally insert just like little tidbits of like info if it's like especially related to something that we're talking about, but really that's not the focus for this class because of course macro, that's something that you'll be learning in the macroeconomics form of this class, right? That's Econ 112. This is Econ 111, so that's micro. Okay, so those are two different approaches of how we can get into economics by like subject matter, small scale ideas versus larger scale ideas, micro versus macro, right? But how do we actually learn about each of these questions, right? Say, for example, here we're in microeconomics. So then how do we actually learn about, well, how do people decide how to spend their money? How will we approach this question? How will we approach the question of what determines the prices of products? and this question of when will a firm expand, downsize, or close, right? So how will we actually approach learning each of these three questions? Well, and I'll actually need to scroll down to get some more space here. But before I directly address that, I will want to get into talking a little bit about a really famous economist named John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is one of the greatest economists of the 20th century. And he pointed out that economics is not just like a subject area, but it is also a way of thinking. So basically, economics isn't about memorizing a bunch of facts about, different types of businesses or the overall economy, right? So it's not just like memorizing a bunch of things to learn how people decide to spend their money or what types of goods and services a nation specializes in, for example. It's not about just memorizing by rote a bunch of little factoids. Instead, economics is about learning how to think about all those different issues, right? So, in order to study economics, though, this requires a different approach compared to other sciences. So, economics is a science, but it is a social science. So, it's not like a science like biology or like physics or something like that. Um, so we need to take a different approach to learning about economics because it's a different type of science. So, for example, right, let's consider a question that, let's say, a biologist might study, right? Specifically one specializing in plants, so like a botanist or something like that. So, example question, example question that might be posed in biology might be, does fertilizer help a plant grow faster? Right? A fairly simple uh, question here, but a question that might be studied nonetheless in biology, right? So there might be multiple different ways of trying to answer that question. But one way that you all might have done in like a high school type of class, not necessarily this question in particular, but one method that you've have certainly done sometime in your high school careers is to perform an experiment. So to check, perform an experiment. Right. So again, I'm sure you've all done an experiment before in one of your science classes. Maybe not necessarily this one, but you might have done an experiment, say like in physics or something, or some other science, maybe chemistry. But let's just run with this question here for right now. So to check this question, right, to help us answer this question, let's think about the types of things we will need to perform this experiment properly. So, how to perform experiment properly? Let's list off some things. And here would actually be another time where I ask you all for some ideas about the types of things that you would need in order to do an experiment properly. But again, this is pre-recorded, so we don't have that type of benefit. So let's just go ahead and get into some ideas that I had written down from before. So Of course, for this, we will need multiple plants and fertilizer. For our experiment, fertilizer. There we go. We will want a control group, right? Basically, we will want these multiple plants because we want to have a control group. That is one set of plants that receives no fertilizer. And we will also want an experimental group. Experimental group, which receives fertilizer. Right? And we also, of course, will want to make sure, in order to make sure that this experiment is done properly, right? We want to make sure that both groups receive the same amount of water, sunlight, etc. Right? And that part is important, right? That last bit is very important because if we did not do this last bit properly, let's say we gave the experimental group more water compared to the control group, right? We gave the plants that got the fertilizer more water compared to the plants that didn't get any fertilizer. Then at the end of this experiment, um, let's say that we saw that the fertilized plants did grow faster compared to the non-fertilized plants. But how are we supposed to know that it grew faster because of the fertilizer and not because we gave it extra water, right? We can't say for certain what caused that extra bit of growth. In that case, we can't say that the fertilizer was what caused that extra bit of growth because we gave the experimental group extra bits of water. So it might be because of the extra bits of water that helped it grow faster, or could be a combination of both things, right? But we can't say 100% for certain which it is. So as you can see, in order to perform a proper experiment, we need to keep both the control and experimental groups the same, as in they have to receive the same amount of water and sunlight and etc. But the only difference between these two groups should be, well, one got fertilizer and the other did not. That way, at the end of the experiment, if there are any differences between the plants, we will know for certain that it has to be because one got fertilizer, the other did not get fertilizer. Since that was the only thing that was different, that must be what caused the differences at the end of the experiment. So, in economics, though, these types of experiments are much less feasible. So, for example, here we at the top here had an example question that might be posed in biology. Now let's take a look at an example question which might be posed in economics. So, example economics question. Does a higher minimum wage cause unemployment? Right? And when I say minimum wage, this could be like a statewide minimum wage versus like the federal minimum wage. Let's just go with the statewide minimum wage here. But this might be an example question. that we might want to study in economics. The idea behind why a higher minimum wage might cause unemployment, by the way, is just that, well, if business owners have to pay higher wages to the employees, then it makes hiring employees less profitable, right? And of course, in the end, businesses are all about trying to make profit. So if hiring workers becomes less profitable, then they might hire fewer workers, right? Which of course might then lead to higher unemployment. So let's take this question as an example. Well, if we wanted to study this question in the same way that we studied this example biology question, right? That is, by performing an experiment, then it would be kind of awkward to say the least, because we would need to find two identical states, right? If we're talking about like a statewide minimum wage, we would need to find two identical states with identical levels of wages, identical types of industries, as well as industry sizes, because of course, you know, uh, a higher minimum wage can affect different industries by different amounts, right? Because some industries might have more minimum wage jobs than other industries. We would also need to make sure that both of these states have identical populations, identical demographics, because minimum wages can affect different demographics differently. So it's going to, of course, be very difficult, well, actually impossible to do that because no two states in the country are like that. There are no two states which are identical in those ways. So hopefully it becomes clear then that it's not at all possible to perform experiments really to learn about this question. Not to mention, by the way, of course, even if we could do that, there would, of course, be major ethical considerations of performing experiments on people that can like affect their livelihoods. So, there's also that that angle, which is a very important consideration to make if we were to try to approach this problem, in that way. But yeah, hopefully this little demonstration shows that this approach here, this experimental approach, not really feasible if we want to really learn about this topic in economics. So, how will we actually approach things in economics? How will we actually approach learning about these things in economics? Well, the way that we study these questions is through something called models. Now, models are basically just simplified versions of how two or more things interact with each other. An example would be, well, how does a high minimum wage interact with unemployment? Does a high minimum wage, cause higher rates of unemployment? Does it maybe cause lower rates of unemployment? Or maybe are these two things not interrelated at all? Maybe they don't interact in any type of way, right? So to answer this type of question, we would be using a model, just a simplified version of how these two things might be related to see how they interact with each other. Now, the reason why we want to simplify things, right? Why we want to keep things on a simplified level rather than trying to keep things 100% realistic is just because in real life, things can become extremely complicated. So if we were to ask a question like this, which is not a super easy question to answer, really, but if we were to ask a question like that, Real life has so many different variables, so many different things that can interact with uh, wages as well as unemployment. Lots of different things can cause unemployment. Lots of things can affect wages. So, if we wanted to answer this specific question, but we wanted to be 100% realistic, we would have to consider so many, like hundreds of different variables into into our considerations here. And something like that is just far too difficult to properly answer, trying to keep everything 100% realistic. So that's why we try to strip things down to a more simplified version, to just the basic component parts that we actually want to study. So models then all, to some degree, some more than others, but to some degree, they will make simplifying assumptions about how the world works, just to make sure that, well, real life can get incredibly complex. It will be too difficult to try and analyze by counting every single little like detail that can happen in real life. So we need to assume certain things about how the real world works, which helps simplify the real world into something more manageable and easy to understand. So let's actually get into an example of a model. This is going to be our first model of the class. This model is called the circular flow diagram. Okay, so this is usually one of the first models taught in economics because it's a very simple model that just basically what it's supposed to do is it shows how the overall economy is supposed to function between people, like regular people, consumers like you and I, as well as how we interact with businesses, people who, the businesses that, produce the products that we want to buy. Right? So it's a very simple model, an extremely simplified version of reality, but it's still useful just to make sure we're all on the same page about basically how an economy is supposed to function. So there are some assumptions that we are making here with regards to how this works. So I'll go ahead and lay them out here, right? Because all models, to some degree, need to make assumptions in order to simplify things. The first one is simply that there are only households, that is, people like you and me, but I use the term households because we might be including, say, families that might make decisions together as like a unit, but there are only households and firms that make decisions in this economy. So basically what this means is we are ignoring other uh, things like the government. We are just setting aside the government for right now. We're assuming that the government doesn't exist. It's not here in this model. Of course, that's a very uh, a huge simplifying assumption to make, but we're starting with the most basic thing here. So I think it's nice to start with a model where there are only two different like decision-making actors, decision-making entities here, households and firms. So no government and no other countries as well. So we're just talking about a single country. We don't need to worry about the government. We don't need to worry about what other countries might be doing. We only need to worry about these two things here, households and firms. And they interact in two markets. Two markets. Goods and services, that is the products market, where people might want to buy things and where businesses want to sell things to its customers. And the labor market. By which I mean the market where people have to compete with each other to get hired by different businesses, by different companies. People are competing with each other for jobs, right? So that is the labor market where people are trying to get hired and they have to work. When they get hired, they have to work for the businesses, the firms, in order to earn money, right? Because of course, well, how do people earn the money to buy the stuff that they want to buy? How do they earn money to buy goods and services? How do they earn money to buy the products? Of course, they have to earn it by working at a job. So they get the job here in the labor market, right? So this is the basic setup for the circular flow diagram. Those are the basic assumptions for the circular flow diagram. So let's actually get into what this diagram looks like. Okay, so let's take a look at what this model actually looks like. So I'm going to need some extra space, so I'll scroll down a bit like this. Okay, so let's start off by just getting all of the component parts out of the way. As I said, there are households and there are firms. So let's put this near the bottom here. Households at the top, firms near the bottom. And then here on the right, just to save on space, I'm going to abbreviate goods and services as G and S. Market, MKT for market. And then on the left, labor. Market. Okay, so what I'm going to do is for the decision-making entities, that is households and firms, I'm just going to draw a little box around them, a little rectangle. And then around the two different types of markets here, I will draw a circle. Let's try that one again. That's a little bit better, more like an oval, but there we go. I'm basically just doing that to kind of like make sure the distinction here is obvious. The markets have a circle around them, and the decision-making entities, the households, the firms, they have a rectangle around them. So that's just for like organizational purposes. Oh boy. Okay. So first things first. Firms put their goods up for sale in the goods and services market. So here I'm drawing a little dash line to indicate the flow of these goods and services. So goods and services. Firms make them and put them in the marketplace for sale. Now, of course, when households buy them, then these goods and services will then flow into the households. That was meant to be an arrow. Good enough. Um, so again, that is goods and services. Okay, now, of course, households have to pay for these goods and services using money, right? So this solid arrow represents the flow of money. So household spending is represented here by the solid arrow, and this money then it goes to the firms as business revenues. Now, then the question becomes, well, how do households get this money? Of course, they get it by working in the labor market. So they work for the businesses by getting hired in the labor market. So this dashed line here represents the flow of labor they go to the labor market, they get hired, and they work at the firms. There we go. This labor. And firms, of course, have to pay the workers in the form of a wage or salary. So here, this is another sorry, not a dash line, a solid line, because this is again representing the flow of money, the solid line here, from households to the goods and services market. That's spending, which then becomes revenue for the firms, which they pay the workers in the form of wages and salary, which of course then, oh, that's not a straight line at all. Uh, this then becomes income for the households. Right? So that's what the solid line represents, the flow of money. And then the dashed line represents the flow of other things. Here, goods and services on the right-hand side, and then the flow of labor on the left-hand side. Now, this is a very basic model. This is the circular flow, once again, and this is it in its most basic form, right? This is, again, basically just to show you how the economy is supposed to work at its most fundamental level, at the most basic type of level. We have households who need to buy things, and we have firms who are the ones that make the things that the households need to buy. How do they make them? Well, they hire people from the households as workers, as labor to make those things, and they pay them with wages and salary, which becomes income for the households. Then, with that money, households can then buy the things that they need to buy, whether that is, food, paying for rent, paying for healthcare, paying for transportation, hobbies, etc. They pay for those things here in the goods and services market, and that becomes revenue for the firms that make them, right? And that's just things at the basic level. That's how the economy works at the most basic fundamental level. Of course, we could include more things on top of this. You can see other circular flow diagrams where there are more component parts, where there's like the government that they have a part in here as well. There can be financial markets put into this model as well, and there can be international markets, that is, other countries put into this model as well. But this is the most basic fundamental form of the circular flow. And again, the circular flow is just supposed to show how the economy works at like the most basic, easy to understand level. So probably not something like mind-blowing or anything, but still useful to just make sure we're all on the same page. This is in general how an economy is supposed to function. So that will be it for this video. So I will see you all next time.